Marcus Thompson sat in the corner booth of the small diner near the naval base, just like he did every Tuesday morning for the past 3 years. At 62, he moved with the careful precision of someone whose body had seen better days, but his eyes still held the sharp awareness that never really left a soldier. The waitress, Sarah, knew his order by heart. Black coffee, scrambled eggs, wheat toast, no butter. She also knew not to make small talk. Marcus preferred the quiet. The diner was a simple place, nothing fancy, with checkered floors and red vinyl seats that had seen decades of use. It served the kind of basic American food that reminded Marcus of simpler times. Most mornings, the place was filled with younger sailors grabbing quick breakfasts before their shifts, their conversations loud and full of the kind of energy that comes with youth and purpose. Marcus listened to them sometimes, remembering when he was their age, when the world seemed full of possibilities and dangers that could be conquered with enough training and determination. But Marcus had learned that some things couldn't be conquered, only endured. The limp in his left leg was a permanent reminder of his last mission, 35 years ago. The doctors had done their best, but shrapnel doesn't care about medical advances. He walked with a slight favor to his right side, and climbing stairs took longer than it used to. Most days the pain was manageable. Some days it wasn't. Those were the days he stayed home reading old books and watching the news, wondering what the world was becoming. Nobody at the diner knew much about Marcus. They knew he was a veteran. That much was obvious from his bearing and the way he carried himself. He wore simple clothes, usually a plain t-shirt and jeans, nothing that drew attention. His hair was gray now, cut short in a style that hadn't changed in 40 years. He paid his bill in cash, left a decent tip, and nodded politely to Sarah on his way out. If anyone had asked him what he did for a living now, he would have told them he was retired. If they pressed for details about his military service, he would have changed the subject. The truth was, Marcus had served in ways that most people couldn't imagine and wouldn't believe if he told them. He had been part of operations that would never appear in history books, in places that didn't officially exist on any map. He had done things that were necessary but not pleasant, and he had lost friends whose names were carved into his memory, but would never be carved into any memorial. The medals and commendations were locked away in a box in his closet, along with photographs of men who would never grow old, and letters from families who thought their sons had died in training accidents. After leaving the service, Marcus had tried different jobs. He worked construction for a while, his hands remembering the satisfaction of building something solid and useful. He drove trucks cross-country, finding peace in the long stretches of highway and the solitude of the cab. He even tried working security at a shopping mall, but the uniform felt wrong, like he was playing dress-up in someone else's life. Eventually, he had saved enough money to buy a small house near the base, and his military pension was enough to cover his simple needs. The house was neat and organized, everything in its place. He had learned long ago that discipline in small things led to discipline in big things. His bed was made every morning with hospital corners. His dishes were washed and put away after every meal. His tools were clean and organized in the garage. It was the kind of order that comes from years of military training, but also from the need to control something in a world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable. Marcus didn't have much contact with his old unit. Most of the men he had served with were dead, and the few who were still alive had scattered across the country, trying to build new lives just like he was. They exchanged Christmas cards sometimes, brief notes that said very little but meant a lot. "How are you doing?" "Fine. How's the family?" "Good. Hope you're well. Take care." The kind of conversation between men who had shared everything and now had nothing left to say. On this particular Tuesday morning, Marcus noticed a new face in the diner. A young man, maybe 25, wearing the crisp uniform of a Navy SEAL. He was sitting alone at the counter, drinking coffee and reading something on his phone. There was something familiar about his posture, the way he held himself, that reminded Marcus of his younger self. The same alertness, the same readiness, the same confidence that came from knowing you were part of something elite and important. Marcus finished his breakfast and stood up slowly, his leg protesting the movement. He left his usual tip and walked toward the door, passing close to where the young SEAL was sitting. For just a moment their eyes met in the reflection of the window, and Marcus saw something he hadn't expected. Recognition. Not of him personally, but of what he represented. It was the look one professional gives another. the acknowledgement between people who understand what real service means. But Marcus kept walking. He had learned long ago that the past was better left buried, and that some stories were not meant to be told. He pushed through the glass door and stepped into the warm morning air, heading home to another quiet day in a life that most people would find unremarkable. He had no way of knowing that his carefully constructed anonymity was about to be challenged in a way he never expected. Lieutenant Jake Rodriguez had been stationed at the base for only 2 weeks, but he was already developing routines. The diner was convenient, the coffee was decent, and it was quiet enough for him to review mission briefings before heading to training. At 26, Jake was relatively new to the SEAL teams, having completed his training just 18 months earlier. But he had already proven himself on 2 deployments. He had the kind of focused intensity that marked him as someone destined for leadership, combined with the humility that came from understanding how much he still had to learn. This morning, he had noticed the older man in the corner booth. There was something about him that caught Jake's attention, not his appearance, which was unremarkable, but the way he moved. Despite his age and obvious physical limitations, the man carried himself with a precision that spoke of military training. Jake had been around enough veterans to recognize the signs, but this was different. This man moved like someone who had been trained not just to fight, but to disappear. Jake's curiosity was one of his defining characteristics. His instructors had noted it during SEAL training, his tendency to ask questions, to dig deeper, to understand not just what he was supposed to do, but why. It had served him well in the field, where the ability to read situations and people could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. His teammates sometimes joked that Jake could spot a fellow operator from a mile away, but they respected his instincts. After the older man left, Jake found himself thinking about him throughout the morning training session. His team was working on close-quarters combat drills, the kind of repetitive practice that built muscle memory and trust between teammates. But part of Jake's mind kept returning to the brief moment when their eyes had met in the window reflection. There had been something there, a depth of experience that went beyond normal military service. During lunch break, Jake approached Sarah, the waitress who seemed to know everyone who came through the diner. She was friendly but protective of her regular customers, and Jake respected that. He ordered a sandwich and made casual conversation before mentioning the man from the morning. "Oh, you mean Marcus," Sarah said, wiping down the counter. "He's been coming here for years. Real quiet type, always polite, tips well, pays in cash." She paused, studying Jake with the shrewd eyes of someone who had been serving military personnel for decades. "Why do you ask?" Jake shrugged, trying to appear casual. "Just seemed familiar, I guess. Thought maybe we had served together somewhere." Sarah smiled knowingly. "Marcus keeps to himself, but I can tell you he's one of the good ones. Whatever he did in the service, it was something important. You can see it in the way he carries himself." That afternoon, Jake found himself taking a different route back to his quarters, one that led him through the residential area near the base. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but his instincts told him there was more to Marcus Thompson than met the eye. Jake had always been good at reading people, and everything about the older man suggested a level of training and experience that went far beyond conventional military service. The neighborhood was modest, filled with small houses that were clearly home to retirees and military families. Jake walked slowly, observing details the way he had been trained to do. Most of the houses showed signs of families, children's toys in yards, multiple cars in driveways, the kind of organized chaos that came with active lives. But one house stood out for its pristine condition and obvious solitude. The lawn was perfectly maintained, the edges trimmed with military precision. The driveway was clear except for a single, well-maintained pickup truck that looked like it was washed weekly. The curtains were drawn, but Jake could see that they hung with perfect symmetry. Everything about the property spoke of discipline and order, the kind that became second nature to people who had lived by strict codes for most of their lives. As Jake walked past, he noticed something that made him pause. In the small garden beside the front steps, there were specific types of plants, hardy, low-maintenance varieties that someone might choose if they needed to leave quickly or for extended periods. It was a small detail, but it fit with Jake's growing suspicion that Marcus was more than just a regular veteran. That evening, Jake did something he rarely did. He used his security clearance to run a basic background check. He told himself it was just curiosity, but deep down he knew it was more than that. Something about Marcus had triggered his professional instincts, and Jake had learned to trust those feelings. The results were frustratingly limited. Marcus Thompson, born 1963, served in the Navy from 1981 to 1989. Honorable discharge. No criminal record. Current address matched the house Jake had observed. But there were gaps in the record, periods where Marcus seemed to have disappeared from official documentation. For someone with Jake's training, those gaps were more telling than any detailed service record. Jake had seen similar patterns before, in the files of operators whose work was so classified that their official records were deliberately vague, the kind of men who served in units that didn't officially exist, doing work that would never be acknowledged. Jake knew that some of the most decorated warriors in American history had service records that looked disappointingly ordinary on paper. As he lay in his bunk that night, Jake found himself planning his next visit to the diner. He wanted to observe Marcus more carefully to see if his instincts were correct. There was something about the older man that called to him, a sense of recognition that went beyond the usual bonds between military personnel. Jake had a feeling that Marcus Thompson had stories that would never be told, secrets that were carried in silence, and a level of experience that few people could even imagine. What Jake didn't know was that his background check had triggered security protocols that were still active after all these years. In a government building 3,000 miles away, someone had noticed the inquiry into Marcus Thompson's records, that someone was about to make a phone call that would change everything for both men. Marcus was reading on his back porch when his phone rang. It was an old landline, the kind that actually rang with bells instead of electronic chimes, and Marcus preferred it that way. He didn't own a cell phone and saw no reason to start now. The few people who needed to reach him had this number, and anyone else could leave a message. He looked at the caller ID and felt his stomach tighten. The number was blocked, but Marcus recognized the area code. Washington, D.C. After 35 years, certain patterns became impossible to forget. He let it ring 3 times before answering, giving himself time to prepare for whatever was coming. "Thompson," he said, his voice neutral and professional in a way that came automatically when dealing with official calls. "Marcus, this is Colonel Patricia Hayes, Defense Intelligence Agency." The voice was crisp, efficient, and carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "We need to talk." Marcus closed his book and sat up straighter. Colonel Hayes wasn't a name he recognized, but the agency was. The DIA handled military intelligence operations that were often too sensitive for regular channels. If they were calling him after all these years, it meant something significant had happened. "I'm retired, Colonel," Marcus said carefully. "Have been for a long time. I'm aware of your status, Mr. Thompson, but your name has come up in a security review and we need to discuss it. Are you secure for conversation?" Marcus looked around his quiet backyard, noting the positions of his neighbors' houses and calculating sight lines automatically. Old habits died hard. "Secure enough." "What's this about?" "Yesterday, a Lieutenant Jake Rodriguez ran a background check on you using his security clearance. Rodriguez is a Navy SEAL, currently stationed at your local base. Do you know him?" Marcus thought about the young man from the diner, the brief moment of eye contact, the sense of recognition he had felt. "I may have seen him around. Why would he be checking up on me?" "That's what we need to find out. Rodriguez has an exemplary record, but his inquiry triggered some flags in our system. Your file, as you know, contains certain protections. When someone with Rodriguez's clearance level accesses it, we get notified." Marcus understood. Even after 35 years, his service record was still classified at levels that required careful monitoring. The missions he had been part of were the kind that could still cause diplomatic incidents if they became public knowledge. People had died to keep those secrets, and the government took their protection seriously. "What do you want me to do?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Find out what Rodriguez knows and how he knows it. If he's just curious, we can handle that quietly. But if there's more to it, we need to understand the scope of the problem. You're in the best position to make contact and assess the situation." Marcus felt a familiar weight settling on his shoulders, the burden of secrets that never seemed to get lighter with time. "Colonel, I left that life behind a long time ago. I'm not equipped for this kind of work anymore. Mr. Thompson, you were one of the best operators we ever had. That doesn't just disappear because you got older. We're not asking you to infiltrate enemy territory. We're asking you to have a conversation with a fellow veteran who seems interested in your background. Marcus stood up and walked to the edge of his porch, looking out at the neat suburban street where he had tried to build a normal life. Children were playing in a yard across the street, their laughter carrying on the evening air. It was the kind of scene he had fought to protect, the ordinary American life that most people took for granted. "What if Rodriguez doesn't drop it?" Marcus asked. "What if he keeps digging? Then we'll deal with it at that time. For now, we just need intelligence. Find out what he wants, what he knows, and whether he's likely to become a problem. You have authorization to share general details about your service if necessary, but nothing operational." Marcus knew what that meant. He could admit to being part of special operations without revealing the specific missions, the locations, or the outcomes. It was a careful balance between honesty and security, the kind of tightrope walk he had been trained to navigate. "I'll need some basic information about Rodriguez," Marcus said, accepting the inevitable. "Background, current assignment, psychological profile if you have it. I'll have a package delivered to you tomorrow morning. Courier service, usual protocols. Marcus, I want you to know that this request comes from very high up the chain. The work you did 35 years ago is still protecting people today. Some of those operations are still ongoing in different forms." After hanging up, Marcus sat in the gathering darkness and thought about the path that had led him to this moment. He had hoped that his past was truly buried, that he could live out his remaining years in the anonymity he had carefully constructed. But the past had a way of reaching forward, no matter how far you tried to run from it. The next morning, Marcus was waiting when the courier arrived. The package was small and unmarked, delivered by a man who looked like he could be selling insurance or real estate. Inside, Marcus found a complete dossier on Lieutenant Jake Rodriguez, along with a secure phone number for Colonel Hayes. Reading through Rodriguez's file, Marcus felt a growing respect for the young SEAL. His record showed intelligence, courage, and the kind of integrity that reminded Marcus of his own younger self. Rodriguez had grown up in a military family, lost his father in Iraq when he was 16, and dedicated his life to following in those footsteps. He was exactly the kind of man Marcus would have wanted to serve alongside. But the file also confirmed Marcus's instincts about Rodriguez's curiosity and determination. This was not someone who would be easily satisfied with simple answers. If Rodriguez suspected that Marcus was hiding something significant, he would keep looking until he found the truth. Marcus realized that he was facing a choice that would determine how the rest of his life played out. He could try to deflect Rodriguez's interest, maintaining his carefully constructed anonymity, but potentially creating a security problem that others would have to solve. Or he could take the risk of making contact, trying to satisfy the young SEAL's curiosity while protecting the secrets he had carried for so long. As he prepared for another morning at the diner, Marcus made his decision. It was time to break his own rules about staying invisible, but first he had to figure out how to approach a conversation that could change everything for both of them. Marcus arrived at the diner earlier than usual, choosing a different table with a clear view of the entrance and the counter where Jake typically sat. He had studied the young SEAL's routine from the intelligence file and knew that Rodriguez usually arrived around 7:30. Marcus was there by 7, nursing his first cup of coffee and trying to appear casual while every instinct screamed that he was about to step back into a world he had spent decades trying to leave behind. When Jake entered, Marcus watched him with professional interest. The lieutenant moved with the controlled awareness of someone trained in close-quarters combat, his eyes automatically scanning the room before settling at his usual spot at the counter. Jake ordered his coffee and pulled out his phone, but Marcus noticed that he was using the reflection in the window to observe the rest of the diner. Good situational awareness, Marcus noted. The kid had been well trained. Marcus waited until Jake was settled before making his move. He stood up slowly, allowing his limp to be more pronounced than usual, and walked to the counter. He chose a stool 2 seats away from Jake, close enough for conversation but not so close as to seem deliberately intrusive. "Morning," Marcus said to Sarah as she approached with the coffee pot. "Could I get a refill and maybe one of those cinnamon rolls?" It was a deliberate deviation from his usual order, and Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Feeling adventurous today, Marcus?" "Sometimes a man needs to try something new," Marcus replied, aware that Jake was listening to the exchange. "Life's too short to stick to the same routine forever." Jake looked up from his phone, meeting Marcus's eyes directly for the first time. "Excuse me," he said politely, "but don't I know you from somewhere? You look familiar?" Marcus turned slightly, pretending to study Jake's face. "I was thinking the same thing." "You military?" "Navy," Jake replied, extending his hand. "Lieutenant Jake Rodriguez." "Marcus Thompson," Marcus said, shaking the offered hand and noting the firm grip and calloused palms that spoke of serious physical training. "Former Navy myself, though that was a long time ago." "What did you do in the Navy?" Jake asked, and Marcus could hear the careful casualness in his tone. The kid was fishing, but he was being subtle about it. "Little of this, little of that," Marcus replied with a slight smile. "Spent some time underwater, some time in places that weren't on the tourist maps. You know how it is." Jake's eyes sharpened at the reference to underwater work, which could indicate submarine service or special operations diving. "SEALs?" he asked directly. Marcus paused, as if considering how much to reveal. "Something like that. Different time, different rules. We didn't talk about it much back then." "Different how?" Jake pressed, his professional curiosity overriding his attempts at casual conversation. Marcus looked around the diner, noting that most of the other customers were absorbed in their own conversations or reading newspapers. He lowered his voice slightly. "Son, there are some stories that don't get told, and some missions that don't appear in the history books. I'm sure you understand that concept." Jake nodded slowly. "Classified operations." "Among other things," Marcus agreed. "You seem like a bright kid, Lieutenant. What made you curious about an old retiree like me?" Jake hesitated, clearly debating how honest to be. Marcus could see the internal struggle between professional caution and genuine curiosity. Finally, Jake seemed to make a decision. "You move like someone who's seen serious action," Jake said quietly. "Not regular military action, but the kind of work that changes how you see the world. I've been around enough operators to recognize the signs." Marcus felt a mixture of pride and concern. Pride that his training was still evident after all these years. Concern that he had become readable to someone with Jake's level of experience. "And that interests you because?" "Because I'm always trying to learn from people who've walked the path before me," Jake replied honestly. "The SEALs have a tradition of passing down knowledge from the older generation to the newer one. Stories, lessons, ways of thinking about problems that you can't learn from textbooks." Marcus studied the young man's face, looking for signs of deception or ulterior motives. What he saw was genuine respect and a hunger for knowledge that reminded him of his own younger self. According to the file, Rodriguez came from a military family and had lost his father in combat. That kind of background produced either broken people or individuals with an unshakable sense of purpose. Jake clearly fell into the latter category. "What kind of work are you doing now?" Marcus asked, turning the conversation back to Jake. "Training mostly," Jake replied. "Learning new techniques, working with the team, preparing for whatever comes next. We do a lot of cross-training with other units, studying different approaches to similar problems." Marcus nodded, understanding the code. Jake was being deliberately vague about his current operations, which was exactly what Marcus would have expected from a professional. "Good. The day you stop learning is the day you start making mistakes that get people killed." "Is that something you learned the hard way?" Jake asked. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. When he looked up, his eyes held a distance that spoke of memories that were better left buried. "Everyone in this business learns that lesson eventually, son. The smart ones learn it from other people's mistakes. The rest of us learn it from our own." Jake sensed that he was approaching dangerous territory, the kind of personal history that was wrapped in pain and regret. He changed his approach. "I don't mean to pry into anything you're not comfortable discussing. I just have a lot of respect for the people who came before us, who did the work that made our current missions possible." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of the respect and genuine interest in Jake's voice. This wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was the kind of professional courtesy that one warrior offered another. Marcus made a decision that he knew might complicate his life considerably. "Tell you what, Lieutenant," Marcus said, finishing his coffee and standing up. "If you're really interested in hearing some old war stories, I've got more time than I know what to do with these days. Why don't you stop by my place sometime? We can talk without worrying about who might be listening." Jake's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "I'd like that very much, sir. When would be convenient?" Marcus pulled out a pen and wrote his address on a napkin. Saturday afternoon if you're free. Say around 2 o'clock? Fair warning, though. Some of those stories aren't the kind that make you feel good about the world. The important ones usually aren't, Jake replied, taking the napkin. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I really appreciate this. As Marcus walked home, he wondered if he had just made a terrible mistake. But for the first time in years, he also felt something that might have been anticipation. Maybe it was time to share some of the burden he had been carrying alone for so long. Saturday afternoon arrived with the kind of perfect weather that made military bases feel almost peaceful. Jake approached Marcus's house with the respectful nervousness of someone about to receive wisdom from a master. He had spent the intervening days researching what he could about special operations history from the 1980s, trying to piece together the kind of missions that Marcus might have been involved in. Marcus opened the door before Jake could knock, having watched his approach from the window. Right on time, he said with approval. Come in. The interior of the house was exactly what Jake had expected, clean, organized, and deliberately sparse. The furniture was functional rather than decorative, and everything had a place. But what caught Jake's attention were the small details that spoke of a life lived in interesting places. A piece of carved wood that looked Southeast Asian, a small rug with patterns that suggested Middle Eastern origins, a photograph of a mountain landscape that could have been Afghanistan or Pakistan. Coffee, Marcus offered, leading Jake toward the kitchen. Please, Jake replied, still taking in his surroundings. You have a nice place here. It serves its purpose, Marcus said, preparing the coffee with the same methodical precision he applied to everything else. Have a seat in the living room. I'll be right there. Jake settled into a comfortable chair and noticed something he had missed on his initial scan of the room. On a side table, partially hidden behind a lamp, was a small framed photograph. It showed a group of men in military gear, but their faces were deliberately obscured by shadows and the angle of the shot. What was visible was their equipment, specialized weapons and gear that Jake recognized as cutting edge for its time. Marcus returned with 2 mugs of coffee and caught Jake studying the photograph. Curious about that? He asked, settling into the opposite chair. It's an interesting shot, Jake said carefully. Looks like serious hardware for that era. Marcus reached over and turned the frame so Jake could see it more clearly. Taken in 1987, he said quietly. Location classified, mission classified, participants classified. But I can tell you that every man in that picture volunteered for something that had no guarantee of survival. Jake leaned forward, studying the image more intently. The gear was indeed advanced for 1987, and the men's positioning suggested they were preparing for insertion into hostile territory. What kind of mission requires that level of secrecy? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, clearly debating how much to reveal. The kind where success means nobody ever knows you were there, and failure means an international incident that could start a war. Counter-terrorism, Jake guessed. Among other things, Marcus confirmed. Hostage rescue, asset recovery, direct action against targets that officially didn't exist. We were the people who cleaned up problems that conventional military couldn't touch. Jake felt a chill of recognition. He was looking at history that had never been written down, operations that existed only in the memories of the men who had carried them out. How many operations? 17 missions over 8 years, Marcus said, and Jake could hear the weight of each one in his voice. 13 successful, 3 partial successes, 1 complete failure. The failure? Jake asked quietly. Marcus's face went distant and Jake could see him traveling back to a place he clearly didn't want to revisit. Somalia, 1988. 6 months before anyone knew there was a problem in Somalia, we were sent to extract a CIA asset who had information about Soviet weapons shipments to various rebel groups. Intelligence was wrong, extraction point was compromised, and we walked into an ambush. What happened? 3 of my team didn't come home, Marcus said simply. The asset died in the first 30 seconds of contact. The intelligence he was carrying was destroyed. Mission failure across the board. Jake could see the pain in Marcus's eyes, the kind of guilt that came from surviving when others didn't. I'm sorry. Part of the job, Marcus said. But Jake could hear that he didn't really believe it. The point is, we did work that required a certain kind of person. People who could make decisions under pressure, who could live with the consequences of those decisions, and who could carry secrets that might outlast their natural lifespans. Marcus stood up and walked to a bookshelf, pulling down what looked like an ordinary photo album. But when he opened it, Jake could see that it contained maps, photographs, and documents that were clearly not meant for public consumption. "This is the real story," Marcus said, bringing the album over to Jake. "Not the sanitized version that makes it into the official histories, but what actually happened." Jake looked at the first page and felt his breath catch. It was a mission briefing document, heavily redacted but still containing enough detail to show the scope and complexity of the operation. The target was described as a high-value asset recovery in a location that was blacked out, but the tactical details were extraordinary. "You kept all this?" Jake asked, amazed. "Copies," Marcus clarified, "hidden in a safety deposit box for 35 years. I told myself it was insurance in case the government ever tried to deny what we did or throw us under the bus. But really, I think I kept it because I needed proof that it all actually happened." Jake turned the pages carefully, seeing glimpses of a shadow war that had been fought while the rest of America went about their daily lives. There were photographs of training exercises, equipment specifications, and after-action reports that detailed missions and locations around the world. "Why are you showing me this?" Jake asked finally. Marcus closed the album and looked directly at Jake. "Because someone like you ran a background check on me this week, and that triggered some people in Washington who still care about keeping these secrets. I got a phone call from the Defense Intelligence Agency asking me to find out what you know and what you want." Jake felt his stomach drop. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cause trouble. I was just curious about your background." "I know," Marcus said, "and I told them that. But they want to be sure you're not going to become a problem, so I'm giving you a choice, son. You can walk away right now, forget we ever had this conversation, and go back to your normal life. Or you can hear the rest of the story, understanding that once you know these things, you become part of keeping them secret." Jake looked at the album, then back at Marcus's weathered face. He could see decades of carefully guarded secrets, of missions that had shaped history in ways that would never be acknowledged. He could also see the loneliness of carrying that burden alone. "I want to hear the rest," Jake said without hesitation. Marcus nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. "All right then. But first I need to show you something that will help you understand just what kind of secrets we're talking about." He stood up and walked toward what Jake had assumed was a coat closet, but when Marcus opened the door, Jake could see that it led to a basement. "Come on," Marcus said. "It's time you met the real Marcus Thompson." The basement was nothing like what Jake had expected. Instead of the typical storage area filled with old furniture and boxes, he found himself in what could only be described as a private museum. The walls were lined with display cases containing military equipment from different eras, medals and commendations from various countries, and photographs that told the story of conflicts that had never made it into the history books. But what dominated the center of the room was a large display case containing a single military uniform. It was black, with no visible insignia or identifying marks, but the fabric and cut spoke of specialized purpose. Next to it hung gear that Jake recognized as some of the most advanced tactical equipment available, even by current standards. "This is what I wore on my last mission," Marcus said quietly, watching Jake's reaction. "August 15th, 1989. Location still classified, objective still classified. But I can tell you that it ended my career in special operations." Jake studied the uniform, noting the careful way it was preserved and displayed. This wasn't just military memorabilia. It was a shrine to a life that had been deliberately hidden from the world. "What happened?" Jake asked. Marcus walked to another display case and pulled out a folder marked with symbols that Jake didn't recognize, but knew were related to the highest levels of military classification. "We were tasked with intercepting a Soviet submarine that was carrying biological weapons to a terrorist organization in the Mediterranean. The mission required underwater insertion, boarding the submarine while submerged, securing the weapons, and extraction without the Soviets ever knowing we had been there." Jake felt his understanding of military history shifting. This was the kind of operation that would have required capabilities that officially didn't exist in 1989. "The insertion went perfectly," Marcus continued, opening the folder to reveal detailed mission photographs. "We used a modified submarine that could dock with the Soviet vessel underwater. My team of 4 men managed to board without detection and locate the biological weapons. Jake looked at the photographs, seeing images of men in specialized diving gear moving through what appeared to be the interior of a submarine. The technical achievement of what he was seeing was staggering even by today's standards. But something went wrong during extraction, Marcus said, his voice taking on the flat tone of someone recounting a traumatic memory. The Soviet captain suspected something and began emergency surfacing procedures while we were still aboard. We had to fight our way out. Marcus pulled off his shirt, and Jake found himself staring at something that made everything else in the room fade into insignificance. Covering most of Marcus's back was an intricate tattoo that told the story of that final mission. But this wasn't ordinary inkwork. It was a masterpiece of detail and symbolism that could only have been created by someone who understood both the technical aspects of the operation and its deeper meaning. The tattoo depicted an underwater scene with two submarines locked together, surrounded by figures in diving gear. But what made Jake's breath catch were the details that only someone with his level of training could fully appreciate. The gear was rendered with perfect accuracy, down to the specific model numbers of equipment that Jake knew had been experimental in 1989. The positioning of the figures told the story of the mission, the successful infiltration, the discovery of the biological weapons, and the desperate fighting retreat. But it was the border of the tattoo that made Jake realize he was looking at something truly extraordinary. Woven into the design were symbols and markings that he recognized from his own training, identifiers used by units so classified that their existence was denied even within the military community. And at the bottom, in small but precise lettering, were the names of the 3 men who hadn't made it home. "My God," Jake whispered, "you're Unit 77. Marcus's head snapped up, his eyes suddenly alert and dangerous. "Where did you hear that designation?" Jake realized he had just revealed something he wasn't supposed to know. During SEAL training, there were rumors, stories about a unit that handled impossible missions in the 1980s. Most people thought it was legend, but some of the older instructors would hint that there had been operators who did work that was beyond anything the rest of us could imagine. Marcus studied Jake's face for a long moment, clearly evaluating whether he had just made a critical mistake in trusting the younger man. "What else do you know about Unit 77? "Just fragments," Jake admitted. "Stories about missions that were so classified that even their existence was compartmentalized. Operations that required capabilities that officially didn't exist. Men who disappeared from normal military records because their work was too sensitive for conventional documentation." Marcus nodded slowly, seeming to come to a decision. Unit 77 was disbanded in 1989, officially because the Cold War was ending, and the need for such extreme measures was decreasing, unofficially because we had become too good at what we did, and some people in Washington were worried about what would happen if a unit like ours ever went rogue. "How many people knew about the unit?" Jake asked. "Maybe 50 people in the entire government," Marcus replied. "The president, a handful of people in the Pentagon, the CIA director, and the men who were actually doing the missions. Everyone else was told that we were part of other, more conventional units." Jake looked again at the tattoo, understanding now why Marcus had been so careful about keeping his past secret. This wasn't just classified military history. It was the kind of information that could still get people killed if it fell into the wrong hands. "The biological weapons," Jake said. "Did you stop them from reaching the terrorists?" Marcus's expression darkened. "We recovered 12 canisters of weaponized anthrax that would have been enough to kill millions of people. But during the fighting, one canister was damaged and began leaking. I was exposed while making sure my team got clear." Jake noticed, now what he had missed before, small scars on Marcus's arms and neck that spoke of serious medical treatment. "That's how you got injured?" "The anthrax exposure required experimental treatment that was almost as dangerous as the disease itself," Marcus explained. "I spent 8 months in a military hospital that officially doesn't exist, undergoing procedures. That left me with permanent nerve damage in my left leg and compromised lung function." "And the tattoo?" Marcus smiled for the first time since they had entered the basement. "Created by a tattoo artist in Hong Kong who specialized in work for people in my line of business. He had security clearances that were higher than most generals. The ink contains microscopic elements that are only visible under certain types of light. It's essentially a coded record of the entire mission. Jake realized he was looking at a living piece of military history, a record of sacrifice and heroism that would never be officially acknowledged. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because someone needs to know," Marcus said simply. "The men who died on that mission deserve to be remembered by someone other than me. And because you remind me of the man I was at your age, curious, dedicated, and willing to carry secrets that matter." Marcus pulled his shirt back on and closed the mission folder. "But now you understand what you're getting into. These aren't just old war stories, Jake. This is information that people have died to protect, and that others would kill to obtain. Are you prepared for that responsibility?" Jake looked around the basement one more time, taking in the weight of history that surrounded him. He thought about his father, who had died carrying secrets of his own, and about the oath he had taken when he became a SEAL. Some things were more important than personal safety. "Yes, sir," Jake said firmly. "I'm ready." Marcus nodded, and Jake could see something like relief in the older man's eyes. For the first time in 35 years, Marcus Thompson was no longer carrying his secrets alone, and Jake Rodriguez had just become part of a brotherhood that existed in the shadows of official history, bound together by shared knowledge of sacrifices that would never be publicly acknowledged. As they climbed back up to the main floor, Jake understood that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend. But he also knew that he had been honored with the trust of a true warrior, and that was a responsibility he would carry with the same dedication that had defined every other aspect of his military service.